The radar bunker at Gurabia Air Base wasn't built for comfort, it was built to listen. Thick concrete walls trapped stale air and the faint hum of outdated Soviet machinery. On most days, the operators inside fought boredom more than enemy aircraft. The Gulf of Sidra was quiet, predictable, and unthreatening. But on that August afternoon in 1981, the radar screens began telling a different story. The room glowed green from the cathode monitors, each sweep of the scanner painting a fresh circle across the darkness. Libyan technicians hunched over their consoles, muttering to themselves as the signal strengthened. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a weather anomaly. It was too clean, too fast, too high. At the center of the room stood a Soviet advisor named Colonel Viktor Sabanov. He'd spent years training foreign crews, and he assumed nothing here could surprise him anymore. But when the radar trace climbed past 10 kilometers, he leaned in. When it went higher, his eyebrows drew together. And when it pushed beyond 20 kilometers, he finally spoke. "Repeat the altitude," Victor said calmly, though his voice carried a sharp edge. 70,000 feet, possibly higher," replied the young Libyan operator, swallowing hard. The colonel exhaled slowly. He knew the Americans had aircraft capable of those altitudes, but the timing was suspicious. The Gulf of Sidra was politically charged, declared a line of death by Libya and dismissed entirely by Washington. Both sides were waiting for the other to blink. And now, on Victor's radar, something was blinking first. The trace maneuvered with an ease that frustrated the operators. Every interceptor Libya possessed would suffocate long before reaching that height. The colonel clasped his hands behind his back, staring at the glowing dot like it was taunting him. "What is it doing now?" he asked. "Holding altitude, but changing speed. Increasing, decreasing. As if testing us," Victor finished. Outside, the heat pressed down on the airbase, but inside the bunker the atmosphere tightened into something colder. Officers stepped closer. Radios crackled. Commander rushed in, already demanding answers. "Is this American?" he barked. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the screen as the mysterious aircraft shifted its path once more. Smooth, deliberate, controlled. "If it is what I think it is," he said finally, "then it is watching us. Carefully." The commander stiffened. "Then we must prepare a response." The colonel didn't object, though he knew the truth. Whatever was up there was untouchable. The Libyan Air Force could chase it, but they could never catch it. And yet, orders would be given. Fighters would scramble. And the Americans, if they were indeed Americans, would be waiting. The scramble siren cracked through the airbase like a knife, jolting pilots from their routine haze. Mechanics sprinted across the tarmac, boots slapping against sun-baked concrete. Libya's MiG-23s sat lined up like impatient predators, their noses pointed toward the shimmering horizon. But everyone on that runway understood the uncomfortable truth. Predators were only dangerous if they could reach their prey. Inside the command trailer, chaos simmered beneath the surface. A young duty officer rushed toward the base commander. Clutching a clipboard, he nearly dropped twice. "Altitude confirmed at over 21 kilometers, sir. Speed fluctuating but extremely stable." The commander didn't look at the clipboard. His eyes were fixed on the runway where the first MiG-23 was already roaring to life, the desert heat turning its exhaust into a trembling column of distortion. "Get them up. All of them," he ordered. Colonel Viktor Sabanov followed the commander outside, shielding his eyes from the blistering afternoon sun. Even from the ground, he could feel the tension in the air, like the sky was bracing itself. MiG-23 number 1 blasted forward, wheels lifting as it clawed into the sky. Moments later, its wingman followed. The radio chatter filled Victor's headset with clipped phrases, rising heartbeats disguised as military protocol. "Fox 1 climbing. Heading 180. Target bearing steady. Climb rate decreasing, engines strained." The colonel listened, jaw tight. He knew the MiG-23 was a strong fighter, but altitude was its enemy. The Soviet Union had always warned Libya about chasing shadows above its ceiling. Aircraft weren't supposed to hunt ghosts. At 40,000 feet, the pilots were already wrestling their machines. "Commander, we're losing thrust efficiency," one pilot reported, his voice thinner with altitude. "Continue climbing," came the order, stern and absolute. The mysterious intruder still danced above them, untouched by gravity, unbothered by the atmosphere thinning around it. The Americans, if Americans they were, had designed something that treated the sky like a playground. At 50,000 feet, the MiGs began to tremble. Wings shivered. Engines roared in protest. "Colonel," the commander said quietly, "what altitude can a MiG-23 safely engage from?" Victor answered without emotion. "Not this high." The commander's silence said enough. Through the radio, one of the pilots suddenly spoke, a strained whisper. "I see something, a glint, high above. But it's still climbing." The intruder wasn't fleeing. It was waiting. Victor felt a cold knot settle in his stomach. The aircraft wasn't just observing, it was studying their response, watching their limits crumble. "Return to base," Victor advised softly into the headset. "If you push higher, you'll fall out of the sky." But the Libyan command hesitated, pride battling physics. And the sky didn't care whose pride burned first. The message reached Moscow long before the smoke trails over the Mediterranean had faded. Soviet command centers were used to dramatic reports from their advisors abroad, but this one carried a tone they rarely heard: uncertainty. Inside a conference room buried beneath the Ministry of Defense, a group of generals, analysts, and intelligence officers gathered around a long table. Maps covered the walls. A projector hummed quietly, casting the Gulf of Sidra across a screen. At the front stood an air defense specialist, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. "Comrades," he began, "our advisors in Libya confirm a high-altitude intruder, altitude approximately 21 kilometers, performing evasive maneuvers beyond the capability of Libyan interceptors." The room murmured. One of the generals leaned forward, knuckles pressing into the wooden table. "And the nationality?" "Likely American," the specialist replied. "But the exact aircraft type is still unclear." A long silence followed. The Soviets prided themselves on knowing every American reconnaissance platform by silhouette, by engine signature, by radar cross-section. Yet this one didn't behave like anything they had studied. General Voronov, a stern man with a voice like gravel, broke the silence. "You are telling me Libya scrambled fighters and still couldn't touch it?" The analyst nodded. The MiGs reached their ceiling, but the target climbed even higher. It maneuvered at a speed inconsistent with a U-2, yet too controlled for a drone. Whatever it was, it reacted to the interceptors before they even engaged. Two USAF F-15 Eagle fighters taxi side by side on a flat concrete runway, viewed from directly behind at low eye level. Both aircraft show fully visible twin afterburner nozzles, vertical tail fins, and landing gear extended. The left F-15 has the tail code LN clearly visible, with heat blur exhaust spreading across the runway behind it. The right F-15 is slightly farther ahead, also showing strong heat distortion behind the engines. Sky is overcast with smooth gray cloud cover. No shadows, no sunlight. Background shows a faint, low horizon line with blurred treeline. Entire scene is monochrome black and white, high detail, mid-1980s documentary military photo. 16:9 ratio, sharp focus on aircraft, light film grain, no cinematic effects. The Soviets tried to spin the event, calling it a training accident and emphasizing that national borders had been violated. But intelligence analysts knew better. The fact that a plane had flown at 70,000 feet, above almost all known Soviet air defense systems, was humiliating. Whispers circulated that if this aircraft had been able to escape detection for so long, it meant the Americans were leagues ahead in technology. For the U.S., it was a mix of triumph and anxiety. Military strategists quietly celebrated the demonstration of superiority, while politicians braced for the diplomatic storm. Every conversation from the Pentagon to Langley considered one unavoidable question: had the Cold War just taken a dangerous leap forward? Meanwhile, ordinary citizens in both superpowers felt the tension. Families huddled around radios and televisions, listening to the same fragmented reports, trying to make sense of a world suddenly on edge. The line between reconnaissance and confrontation had blurred, and no one could say where the next spark would ignite. By the end of the day, the incident had transcended military channels. It was no longer just a failed interception or a technical error. It was a statement. Technology, ambition, and audacity could tip the balance of power overnight, and the world was taking note. The morning after the shoot-down, the tension was palpable across the globe. In Moscow, ministers gathered in the Kremlin's grand halls, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every report, every satellite feed, every intercepted signal was dissected and debated. The failure of the Soviet air defenses was no longer a secret. It was a catastrophe etched into the memory of every officer present. Across the Atlantic, American intelligence quietly celebrated. Not openly, of course, the world was still a powder keg, but behind closed doors, analysts praised the pilot, the aircraft, and the decades of technological investment that had brought the plane beyond reach. The Cold War was entering a new phase, one in which the Soviets had been shown, unambiguously, that they were no longer the unchallenged masters of the skies. Internationally, reactions ranged from disbelief to alarm. NATO officials convened emergency meetings, debating whether the incident represented a provocation or a demonstration of technological superiority. Non-aligned nations watched with wary fascination, realizing that global power dynamics were shifting, not subtly, but in plain view. Back in the Soviet Union, blame was being assigned. Military advisors argued furiously over who had failed, whose radar systems were outdated, and why protocols had been ignored. The air defense network, once considered invincible, now seemed fragile. Rumors swirled that a top general might be replaced, a minister dismissed. Confidence in the system had been shaken to its core. The American plane itself became legend. The pilot, whose identity remained classified, was lauded in secret commendations. Engineers who had poured decades into the project allowed themselves a rare smile, knowing that their work had fundamentally altered the balance of power. For the first time, the notion of invincibility, the myth that the Soviets could counter any threat, was questioned. By evening, newspapers around the world had framed the event as a turning point. Editorials speculated on what this meant for diplomacy, for military strategy, and for the fragile equilibrium of the Cold War. For ordinary citizens, the narrative was simple but chilling. The skies were no longer just a barrier. They were a stage on which the fate of nations could change in an instant. In hindsight, historians would mark this day as more than an aerial skirmish. It was the day the Cold War's illusions of control were stripped bare. The Soviets had been humiliated. The Americans had proven a quiet but decisive superiority, and the world had glimpsed the future of modern warfare. High, fast, and almost untouchable. And somewhere high above the clouds, the ghost of the reconnaissance plane had already vanished from radar, leaving only a stark reminder. In the new era, audacity and technology were the ultimate weapons, and no one could take the skies for granted again.